I know that there are other things that are on people's minds these days, Ukraine and whatnot, so that a book of this kind isn't exactly a priority. But what I'd like to do in a few minutes is try to explain why I think it's something that people will find useful to read and interesting, and why I wrote it. In looking back at the important events in the life of my generation, and as you can see, my generation was born at the end of World War II, I've realized that and this is the title of the book, Participant Observer, is that at certain moments in my life, I was primarily a participant in politics, and at other times I was primarily an observer. But more interestingly is I was always, in a sense, I was both. That even in the earlier period, when especially in local Montreal politics and in student politics and then in Quebec politics, where I was clearly a participant, I was at the same time, maybe because I was an anglophone in Quebec, maybe because I'm an intellectual and really never wanted to have a political career as such, even if I was close to the political process. There was some of me that was still an observer, and I wrote about that and I gave talks about that during that period. And then in the second part of the book, which talks about my period of primarily as an observer, because it was not in the world in which I was a citizen, but it was in Scandinavia, especially in Sweden and Finland, and then in other countries. I was an observer, but I was lucky enough to be close enough to keep people who were actually the participants, who changed the countries that they lived in. And several of the chapters talk about Sweden especially, but other countries as well. And where I was an observer, clearly I couldn't get elected to the Swedish parliament, for example, but I was very close to people who were making key decisions, both domestically and in international relations, where Sweden played a very important role. So in a good part of my life, I was able to combine this element of being a participant and observer, and that I think is pretty unusual. I think that most people are one or the other. If you are an observer, and I've been based at academic institutions, as Greg pointed out, then you are only an observer. You're not really a participant. In fact, it's discouraged from being a participant. And if you're a participant, especially if that's your career and your livelihood as an elected politician, you can't really be an observer. Your career is on the line in terms of what you say, what you write, internally, yes, you can be more critical, but publicly and just in normal circumstances, you cannot really be a critical observer. And I was lucky enough to be both, not only in Quebec, where the early part of my activity takes place, but even in these European countries, especially Sweden and Finland, where I got to spend a fair amount of time. In the last part of the book and of my career, I'm an observer in Quebec and Canada, again, not as really a participant, but with my links to various institutions, with various people who are active, largely as a consultant, as somebody who wrote in the media, who gave talks. I also think that indirectly I could affect certain discussions, certain possibilities. A particular interest of mine during that period was political institutions, the way we carry on elections, civic education, and I like to think that indirectly, at least through my various activities and publications and so on, I might have had a bit of an effect on these matters in Quebec and in Canada more widely. So the book covers these sort of three periods: the Montreal Quebec period, the Europe period, and then finally back to as more of an observer, but in Canada. And I think it's a story worth telling. Sometimes I wonder if the way the world is moving now, whether the experience that I describe and learn from is all that relevant. And I'm sure that Andrew will make me try to justify that in his questioning. But I'm happy to answer your questions as well, if you or take your comments. And thank you. It's all yours, Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. Again, my name is Andrew Sharpe, and I was delighted to be asked to basically serve and be part of this dialogue. And I actually, I have a lot in common with Henry, but we really haven't known each other well in terms of at all, really, for many years. But I was always aware of him. But we overlap in so many ways, which we discovered for lunch today. I knew his brother Arthur, who I worked with here in Ottawa in the 1980s with the Social Planning Council. His co-founder of Inroads, John Richards from Simon Fraser University. I've worked with him on Indigenous issues the last 10 years, so I know John very, very well. But then I also was in Montreal from 1974 to 82 when I was a student at McGill University, and of course Henry had been a student at McGill University earlier. I lived in Côte-des-Neiges, and that's where Henry lived for many years. I taught at Cégep for 5 years. As Henry also taught at Cégep. I was active in the Montreal citizens movement, and we know people in common from that experience. So, and I knew of Henry. Now, one way we were, I'll just start off here, was the basically the referendum of 1980. I actually knew of Henry at the time. You were the anglophone sovereigntist, as your former student Mulcair says, and you were very prominent. And I thought, that it was very courageous of you, but you were not basically well regarded in the anglophone community. I think that's a fair statement. So I was actually very active campaigning on my street, which is basically just above the hill where they live now, and on Ridgewood in Montreal. I was responsible for canvassing all that area for the campaign of, and I knew who was voting yes and no at that time. So I was very involved in that. I was very, very strong, as you were probably canvassing for the no side. Not directly.
But at least you didn't call me and leave nasty messages.
No, I did not. So I guess my first question is about your history. And I think that's really, you were very much a participant in that participation. Most of the Anglophones in Quebec, including myself, have a very strong attachment to Canada. We kind of bought into the Trudeau perception of a bilingual country, and here's two of the world's major cultural and linguistic groups working together, and that's a goal. We should really work together. And unlike, let's say, Belgium, where the two linguistic groups don't get along, or Czechoslovakia, where they ended up splitting up, it's better to work together as opposed to just separate. And I just always wondered why you chose that other path, and your relations to Canada. You're better known, say, in Montreal than you are in Ottawa, because you really weren't involved as much at the federal scene. You were more involved in the provincial scene.
Right.
So I guess my first question for you is, looking back, do you have any regrets about the path you took, and what do you think the contributions were?
Do I have any regrets? No. I'm not. It's not my style to look back and sort of say it could have been different. I mean, I do. That's a personality.
Okay.
But why did I choose to? Well, first of all, I identified with Montreal. I didn't necessarily identify with Quebec all that much, or in Canada. I mean, for me, Montreal was my home, and it was a great place because whether you were English or French or another language, you just felt comfortable there. And I was an immigrant. I was from an immigrant family, and so on. So that was my first thing. And in a sense, Quebec and Canada were abstractions. I mean, I wasn't a political science professor at the time, so I wasn't that much oriented toward politics. So when I got involved, it was first at the level of Montreal. But then the timing, and you didn't grow up in Montreal.
No, I'm from Ottawa.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the timing, if you think about it, if you want to make the world in which you live a better place, and I was part of that generation, right? As you read in the first chapters of my book, Quebec was what was happening in Quebec in the late 70s was pretty exciting. Mm-hmm. And it was, if you're going to get involved, in theory, remember what did we say? Think globally, but act locally. Well, for me, first it was Montreal, but then given the sort of exciting stuff that was happening around Quebec, not just in politics, but in trade union stuff and so on. That was where the action was. And that's what brought me into it. And then I discovered, as I got more and more into it, that the same people I work with on other issues, on community issues, on urban issues, they all were sovereignists. They were, and they thought the PQ was too moderate, but they would support it because sovereignty was going to allow us to build a better society. And so it was something that came to me naturally. I'm not a nationalist, as somebody who goes around waving flags. I never thought that way. But if you had grown up as I did, which was a bit, I have to say, as an Anglophone, I was still in a small minority, even in these organizations, which were not sovereignty per se. They were just in terms of social change in Montreal and in Quebec. There were not many Anglophones. The Anglophones just didn't really relate to Quebec. And I happened to do so. I wasn't the only one, but I was, even in my group of Anglophone progressives, I was one of the few who said the natural next step is to support sovereignty. Most of them, and I can name them if you want to know, said that's one step too far, and they wouldn't go that far. But to me, it was a natural development.
Okay, that's great. The next point is the whole question of social democracy, which you've been a student of social democracy your whole life. And I'm also that way. Actually, was in the NDP in West Mount Saint Marie at the time when I was in Richmond. So I've been always kind of involved with the NDP. But you studied particularly in Sweden. And I guess I'd like to talk to you about your future vision for social democracy, because right now it seems to be kind of a crisis. There's so many different variants or types of it. And I look at, let's just say, the UK, where you have Blair, this kind of right wing, but he was elected 3 times, very popular,
successful, yeah,
extremely successful. Then you have Jeremy Corbyn, who was basically kicked out of the party in many ways, and he was extreme left and anti-Semite, some said. Anyway, and now they have we'll see who. Then you look at Canada, and again the same thing. Now you look at Mulcair in the 2015 election. I think that was the first time I'd ever voted not for NDP. And why did I vote for the NDP? Because the NDP were to the right of the Liberals. They wanted to get elected. They wanted to have credibility on the fiscal side. So they said, oh, we basically can't have a deficit, which was, and Trudeau said, well, we don't really care about deficits anymore. And then even, I remember Mulcair saying, well, marginal tax rates are already 50%. We can't increase taxes on the rich anymore. And Trudeau put in a higher tax on the rich. So at that time, there was kind of a reversal. Now the NDP has gone back because Mulcair is no longer there. But I just wondered, which of the types of social democracy do you think is the future for social democracy, or it depends on the context, depends on the country, and you really can't generalize?
I mean, my sense is that the period of social democracy has passed. I'm not talking about Canada as such. I'm talking about the democratic world. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about what social democracy stands for. We should try to preserve the achievements that social democrats in power have achieved. But the socialist candidate in yesterday's French election got something like 2% of the vote. In Sweden, which is the home of social democracy, they are able to govern, but only with the help of centrist parties. They used to get high 40s, and then the communists would put them over 50%. Now they get 30% if they're lucky, typically high 20s. So they need support from the centrist parties, which limits what they can do. Now, that is a reality pretty much everywhere. Do you want me to try to explain why it is? And I can certainly tell you about why it is in Sweden. In Sweden, the populists, reacting to what had been a totally wide open immigration policy with absolutely no controls, which allowed all people who said they were refugees, whatever they really were, came in, 300,000 people in 2 years for a country that was 9 million people. Imagine that. And so fundamentally, the right-wing populists now get 20% of the vote. And when the right-wing populists take 20% of the vote, there isn't going to be a social democratic government anymore. And there's no reason to think there will. Now, the Social Democrats, with their in coalition, still do a pretty good job of keeping Sweden, keeping the just go. We spend a fair amount of time in Stockholm. It's still a terrific place, and so many of the things you see were brought in by the socialists, the social democrats, and are being preserved. But nobody is going to say the future of this, the future lies with social democracy. And I would think that you could say that about pretty much any country these days. Canada has never had a dominant social democratic party. So I don't really think very much about Canada in that context. But you know, it's the Social Democrats are doing better now than they did a few years ago when they were risking disappearing, even in Sweden, or becoming a minor party. But they'll never go back to what they were, and it's a different world.
So what does that mean the future is? Is kind of center leftism coalition between NDP Liberal? That's your vision for the future. That's the best way forward.
I would say that's the best. Well, yes, in Canada for sure. In each country, even in Britain, as you say, the Labour Party might win, but it won't be a radical Labour Party. It'll be a very moderate Labour Party.
Blairite, or not quite?
Well, what's his name? The current leader. It certainly is.
Stammer, right?
It sounds very centrist in his positions. I don't follow British politics that closely, but that's my sense that and in a certain way, it's not failure, because those things that social democrats in power did have pretty much remained. It's true, like in Sweden, it's not quite the same, but when you have 15% immigrants, to maintain the same amount of equality, what we call the Gini coefficient, as you economists know, it's a bit harder to do. But as I said, spend some time in Stockholm and you'll know what social democracy feels like.
Right. But back to your point about Sweden and immigration, like I know Swedish case is unique, but basically it sounds like you're saying that all these refugees and immigrants coming into Sweden were very bad for social democracy because they fueled the right. Does that mean we European countries should not allow refugees in? Look at Germany accepting 1 million people from Syria in 2015. Wasn't that a really good thing to do? People said at the time that's going to cause a lot of problems for the government in Germany, but they seem to survive.
Well, in the case of Sweden, I mean, I think the Germans did it better, and the economy at the time was better able to absorb them. And remember, per capita was still a lot more in Sweden than in Germany. But the important thing is that immigration is I'm trying to think of it. What happened in Sweden, and it's pretty much happened everywhere in Europe, Denmark has gone even more extreme, is they've gotten, including on the left, they've gotten much more, and partly just for purely electoralist reasons. They can't get elected if they have an open immigration policy. So this has happened all over Europe. The left, to some extent, has accepted this. I don't know. I think you have to look at each case separately and say, is that acceptable or has it gone too far?
Yeah.
But there is a reality that.
But why is that reality so different than, say, Canada, where now we're going to take up to 400,000 immigrants a year, and no one even on the right is complaining about that, except maybe Bernier, but no one takes them too seriously. Certainly even Poilievre is not complaining about immigrants. And we're taking immigrants from, Asia, Africa, not from Europe.
Well, in Canada's a weird place. Eh? I mean, what happened, we're not really taking immigrants. What we're taking in is temporary people who come in as students and as part-time workers and so on. And then they manage to get into line. And so we're not.
There's still a lot of immigrants, landed immigrants. There's both.
Well, but the large group is not. There's millions of people out there who are trying to be immigrants, and the line is very long. Sure. But there's all these people who skip the line. And we have a lot of institutions who have a vested interest in it. If we didn't have those non-immigrants who come in as students and then become landed, a lot of our educational institutions would have to close.
Oh, for sure.
So there's a real lobby in Canada. And because that's a group that, in a sense, it's not like maybe now with Ukraine, but normally it's not, suddenly coming on a boat with thousands and thousands of people. It's people coming in as students, so they're sort of fitting in and then gradually adjusting. So Canadians don't have a sense of a whole bunch of immigrants coming into the country, even though the numbers, as you say, of non-Canadians who stay is pretty large.
Yeah.
So there's no perception of this. And so, you know, and also we're farther away. We can control our borders a lot more easily than they can in Europe. So the perception in Canada is that immigration is not really a significant development. In much of Europe, you can't miss it. I mean,
well, it's a significant development. It's changing the composition of the country. Look at Toronto, and half the population of Toronto was born outside the city, and we're doing well adjusting to that. I think that speaks well of Canada, that we're able to accept all these people without the social strife you get in Europe.
Well, old countries have a harder time in general than new countries.
Yeah,
we're all immigrants to some extent, and I think that's part of Canada. I'm not criticizing it. I think that's good, but I think we can explain why
a fundamental difference in terms of social democracy and immigration between Sweden and Canada.
Yeah, although, as I said, until 3 years ago, Sweden was even more open than Canada, and the thing just got out of control. And then, in order to stay in power, the Social Democrats had to basically say, okay, now we're going to control things. Not as much as the Danes, but we're going to control things.
Well, hopefully in the long term, the immigrants to Sweden can integrate, learn Swedish, get jobs. Like that's happened in Canada.
Well, no, they really did make an effort before this huge mass immigration. They have very good policies attempting immigration, but the social adjustment was harder. Because let me give you an example. In Sweden, every woman works. It's just unheard of that a woman stays home and the husband supports her, unless she's 80 years old. Many of these immigrants came from countries where the women didn't work. It was just not done. Well, the fact is you cannot really live on one salary in Sweden. There are a normal salary, you know, if you're CEO of Volvo or something, you can do it. But so it was a real challenge to integrate families in that immigrant families, because most of this immigration to Sweden, when it went way up, was from places like the Middle East and Turkey and so on. So it presented a challenge. In Canada, you can get along. You can make, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of, I don't know the data, it's not my specialty, but there's a lot of families where only the man works and they manage. You can't do it in Sweden. The taxes were too high. The salary levels were much more even, you know. So it's a minor point, but it does explain a lot.
Okay. Well, let's maybe turn on to another topic. You have been a great advocate of proportional representation, and you have a lot in the book about that and Canada's experience, other experience. But then at the very end of that discussion, you say the bottom line is this is pretty small potatoes compared to the big issue of the threat of populism and Trumpism and so on. It's just really tinkering around the edges, and it really wouldn't have fundamentally changed democracy in Canada. We're a democratic country if we had some type of PR system.
I don't quite say it, but look, Trump, I have become obsessed with Trump, and now, of course, there's Ukraine, but until Ukraine, really, my obsession was Trump, and it made me appreciate Canada, right?
As a democracy.
Yeah, and our institutions, for all our criticism and our ability and the desirability of improving them, however bad they may be, we haven't got a Trump, and there doesn't seem to be a Trump waiting out. Well,
we'll see about that.
Well, you know, Poilievre is conservative and so on. Not quite a Trump yet, as far as I can tell. But it puts things in perspective.
Yes.
Now, you know, ask Rael here. We were really, those of us working for proportional representation, we were really disappointed. First by Trudeau, just never, you know, and then by Legault in Quebec. We were really disappointed. Now, as I said, you know, in what you're quoting is in the context of some of the major challenges we're facing, a Putin or a Trump, yes, we can get along. And in Canada, we're a little bit sheltered from this pure two-party system that they have in the United States because of our regional parties and so on. So we have a bit more of the kind of pluralism that you get from proportional representation. But I think the American electoral system is a disaster. It is for various reasons, not just lack of proportionality and so on. So I would not simply say electoral systems don't matter. I think they still matter.
Okay. Now next issue.
Rael
Okay, well, I guess I'll shut up in a few minutes so we can have some more general discussions. Just two more points. One is the whole question of unionism. And as you're on the left, so in principle you support unionism, but your experience with unionism, I would say, hasn't always been the best, because sometimes a small group of people who are part of a union say that they're basically trying to improve all members of the working class, but they themselves have particular privileges and they want to hold on to that at all costs. And I wondered, how important do you think is the union movement for let's say progress, social democracy? They of course argue that they're on the forefront of that, and in many ways they have been historically, but now are they kind of a privilege? I'll just give you an example. Maybe another book that I'm actually next week. Steve Poloz, he's the former governor of the Bank of Canada. He's just written a really interesting autobiography, and he's someone from Ukrainian background, working class. And he grew up in Oshawa, Ontario. And he said in Oshawa, there was basically two classes of workers. There's workers at GM who had cottages and had good salaries. And then the non-unionized workers, Diane Toole, and his father was a non-unionized worker. So he was at basically, there's a different, if you're unionized, you often have a better conditions than the non-unionized workers. Now, obviously the solution is to get everyone unionized, but it's not always that easy. So what is given your experience with unions, how do you see that going in the future?
Well, again, going back to Sweden or the Scandinavia, what you have to remember is in those countries, 60, 70, 75% of workers are unionized, so that nothing really significant could happen without the support of the trade unions. On the other hand, the trade unions, everybody knows that the trade unions are very powerful. So if they act simply in the interests of their members and nobody else, that is not something that they can very much do. So what happens typically, and I followed this many years in Sweden and so on, is you have this basic agreement, especially when you have a social democratic government, but even if you don't, that the unions you have to have a centralized bargaining, and in the centralized bargaining, and essentially, and that includes the private sector, because the association of executives of private companies participate in the process, and they themselves agree upon certain basic rules. And so the bargaining process, the collective bargaining process, is essentially a process in which the national interest has to enter. Doesn't mean you don't have tough bargaining and so on, but ultimately neither side can say, screw you, this is what we want. It just cannot happen because of the structure of the collective bargaining system. But in order to have that, you have to have, first of all, so I take the case of Sweden, like I said, 60, 70% of workers in unions, and the leaders of the big companies, the executives of the big company, in an association that speaks for them. They don't just negotiate corporation individuals. Mm-hmm. So what you've described was General Motors was one company, because it was a company town, right? Mm-hmm. And the local unions. So overall, this has worked pretty well. And we tried it in Quebec during the when I was in the Parti Québécois. We tried it with the centralized bargaining, mm-hmm, with the public and parapublic sector. We couldn't include the private sector because it wasn't organized for it, but we did include the public and parapublic sector, which in Quebec is quite large. And that fell apart in 1982, 83. Remember, we were talking about that yesterday, when the unions essentially said, yes, the province is in a terrible economic slump, difficulty, unemployment has gone through the roof, the government has no money. Nevertheless, we expect our 20% raise. And that created such a rift, such a powerful, it drove me, in a sense, out of a positive sense that Quebec could be different, that Quebec could do things that English-speaking North America couldn't, that we were somehow capable of some kind of collective coming together. We were small, we shared the same language and so on, that other places couldn't. I was more in politics than teaching at the time, but Francis was teaching at the CEGEP, which was a very militant college, and their attitude was, screw everybody, we're going to get our raise, and we'll close down the province if we can't get it. And it created this, not only did it create this real tension, but ultimately the Parti Québécois never recovered as a mild social democratic party, and the trade union movement never really recovered, so that they are no longer the kind of important social actor in Quebec that they were 40 years ago.
That's because of what they did in '83.
To some extent. I mean, there's other factors involved, different economic developments in areas where unionization is harder and things like that. But that, for me at least, that was a fundamental breaking point. And that never happened in Sweden. It couldn't happen in Sweden. So there,
Okay.
long answer.
Great. Okay. Well, my final point is actually on a topic that you don't actually talk about in the book at all. And I'm wondering why, because there's a lot of talk about it these days in many places. The old question of the guaranteed annual income, with all the problems in society, why don't we have some type of basic income? I think that's even in the Liberal program. They say they should have a basic income for Canadians. They don't actually define how much it is and so on. But many people on the left think that is the future. We're going to have mass unemployment because of the robots, or we have to guarantee people, everyone, not just the old, not just children, not just disabled, everybody, a certain amount of income per year, unconditional, no work requirements at all. And it's a big issue, and yet you never mention in the book basic income, guaranteed income. What's your perspective on that issue?
Well, you know John Richards as well as me, and so John is sort of, to me, has made a pretty convincing argument that it wouldn't work very well. Let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. First of all, if you want a model country these days in terms of social and economic policy, it's no longer Sweden, it's Finland. And I've spent a lot of time in Finland. Finland has the lowest Gini coefficient apart from Hungary, I think. And it's very well run. It always does best in these comparative educational PISA and so on. And I've spent a lot of time there, and I know people there. So why is it? And it's now we have this world happiness thing every year. They've come in first for the last 5 years. Okay, so when you meet a Finn, you wouldn't see them as very happy, but they're very content. They accept things as they are.
Low expectations.
Well, it's part of that, but it's also because things seem to work. They can't go around frustrated by, oh God, the government hasn't done this and so on. Things seem to work fairly well. And I don't want to get into why I think Finnish institutions are that good at it. But my point, sorry, ask me the question again.
About basic income. Why do they have a basic income?
So they actually had an experiment where a certain amount of the population, they were tested and etc., had 2 years or more of basic income. And so the very Finnish, so we'll test it, because there were top leading Swedish economists who said, we think it's going to work, Finnish economists who think, one of whom I got to know fairly well, we think it's going to work. And ultimately, based on their assessment after the fact, because the question was, what do people on guaranteed income, first of all, how much is it going to cost? It's easy to do it when you only take a small part of the population, but if you take the entire population, say it's eligible, how many will take it rather than staying in the labor market? And what they found was that overall, what they hoped was that those people who were entitled to it, they were selected, I don't know, 20% of the population or whatever it was, some of them would not take it. And even those who took it would do other things, use their time effectively in volunteering or whatever. And the overall assessment, and it was very much discussed because there were some people who really believed in it, but ultimately they assessed that on balance, it was not a good idea, and they let it drop. And I have great faith in the Finns getting it right. I can tell you all kinds of other things about what I learned in Finland and so on, but and that at that point, I stopped getting interested in the subject. Maybe I should have written a sub-chapter explaining why I'm not interested anymore. But I think it's worth reading.
Well, there's a lot of debate in Canada, and BC is the one that's gone the best. They actually had a commission, the NDP government commissioned David Green at UBC, who's a very good economist, and they have 53 different studies on it. And the bottom line was, it's not, we shouldn't go that route. He's got into a lot of flack over that because many people really believe in it. So I completely concur with you. I'm not in favor
You're
of
not
it
in favor.
at all, actually.
I
So
mean,
I guess we share that view.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you can subsidize low-paid workers.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
But that's
yeah.
a different matter.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not a fan of the CAQ per se, as you can imagine. They're a center-right party, basically a one-man show almost. So you'd have to look at each of the policies individually. The Dawson College thing, it's a, you know, I agree, it's unfortunate because Dawson was getting overcrowded, even though it has a beautiful building, but it was getting overcrowded, and there was a plan to build a larger campus. I do have some sympathy. So you know, the disappointment is legitimate that they've decided that the money is not available. But I do want people to understand that English language education in Quebec now, in many of the cégeps where we taught, the majority of students almost are not English speaking. So the English educational system is serving a much larger group than the English speaking population. Now, I understand that because if you finish a French high school and you have ambitions to get a better job, then you have some incentive to go to a French language cégep. I mean, English language college, English language cégep. But at a certain point, it gets too much. When more than half the students in an English language college are of non-English background, and increasingly French background. So the question is, what do you do? And it's a politically dynamite issue because it's not that to limit it actually antagonizes some of the francophones. Sure. Who's, you know, on the other hand, you just cannot have a sector that is basically not serving the sector that it's supposed to. So they've tried to come up with some compromise. The Liberals had a very strange idea, which now anyway, I won't go into detail, but now they've abandoned that idea. So I have some sympathy with the question of, if you have minority language institutions that serve a large proportion of people who are not of the minority language, do you want to restrict it at some point to not purely to the minority language people, but at least keep the numbers within bounds? And that, I think that's a reality that even the Liberal Party, so now the Anglophone, and I guess Stephen is part of that, the Anglophone minority is very angry, but I have some sympathy with the notion of some kind of limitation. I don't necessarily support the particular way it's being done, and I don't think anything will happen before the election. I think it's such a hot potato that they're going to put it off, even though it's on the books. But I think they'll put it off before the election, which is in early October. Mm-hmm. So Steve, I hope that doesn't that answers you to some extent. I guess the question is, because of especially the environmental issue and so on, politics is much more seems to be more complicated than in the earlier period. Yeah. And I think that's true. For me, I mean, supporting Quebec sovereignty made me different from most of my people. For most of the people around me, the educated, my generation of educated people of my generation, especially in social sciences, humanities, and so on.
The Anglophone class, not
no, I'm talking about my generation generally. I'm not talking about the sovereignty issue, but just generally. Mm-hmm. What it meant to be progressive, what it meant to favor a better society was fairly obvious to us. Tied to this idea of social democracy and so on. It's just not as obvious these days. And I think it has something to do, you know, as I gave the example of, we had an election in France yesterday, and the old social democratic party doesn't exist. The old conservative party doesn't exist. You've got a centrist party under a centrist president that has no particular ideology. Then you have extremes of the left and the right. And there is, so the sense that of what was represented by social democracy, which was dominant in much of Europe, and even under Mulcair, you may not have liked him, but the NDP might have become a major party. That period is over, and it's not going to come back. And I think the environmental issue is part of it. The environmental issue is a very difficult issue to organize around, because you can't resolve it tomorrow. And so even though it's there for everyone, when the election comes, it's going to disappear, because what happens in an election is, what can you do tomorrow? And so other issues emerge, and the environmental issue fades, even though everybody says it's so important and so on. And that's frustrating. So I hope that answers your question. Or let's call it independence, Scottish independence, plus the more.
Nationalism, that's what they call it. They call it nationalism.
Yeah, but it's not ethnic. It's very much tied
They
to
would call it ethnic.
a
In the
vision.
same way as the Irish would call it ethnic.
No,
Anyway,
no, it's not. I mean, I spent time there and they go out of their way. For example, they had no sympathy with Quebec's language policy. And it was interesting to try to say, well, look, we have a language. No, ours has nothing to do with language, nothing to do with culture. It's just simple that we can do a better job because we're smart, we have these things in common, but and they really, I was impressed by this, but no discrimination. If you're Scottish, doesn't matter if you've been here a year or 2 years or 5 years or 18 generations, you're Scottish. So my point is that under those circumstances, if I were there voting as a Scot, I probably would vote yes in the next referendum, not that there will be one very quickly. We don't have that same condition in Quebec anymore. And part of it is that the new generation is just not interested.
I don't think you're answering the question, Henry.
Well, what I'm saying is, if we did have the situation that I had when I was growing up, or when I was 25 and 30, namely that the progressive forces were identifying, and that includes youth, right? Because youth is usually more progressive. We're identifying with Quebec independence or sovereignty. If that came again, I would certainly identify with it. I wouldn't say preserve Canada at all costs. I'm not that, just as I wouldn't say preserve Great Britain at all costs. But I don't see it happening, because young people in French Canada and Quebec, they have other priorities. I mean, I look at I look at the numbers, and for them, the sort of project around Quebec sovereignty doesn't mean anything. There is a small minority for whom it does, but it just doesn't mean anything. It's almost a cultural thing. So in that context, my answer is, I'm not opposed to it, but I don't think it's relevant. Which is in certain ways it's sad, but there have been so many changes in so many other ways. Why not that? I don't know if that answers your question.
It doesn't actually, but nevertheless, it's an answer.
It's
It seems to be that you're on the fence on it rather than.
Well, the Parti Québécois is, in this election, if it elects 2 members of the National Assembly, it'll be lucky. And I know the leader quite well. He's a nice guy, but he really had no business becoming a politician, but that's another matter. And it just doesn't attract young people, right? If you're going to be young and sovereignist, you're going to vote for what are they called? Québec Solidaire. But the Québec Solidaire is too, what would we say, too
Ideological? Ideological?
I was actually approaching it from a more of a philosophical point. It's the support of separatism, the support of the idea of the breaking into the constituent parts rather than a whole, in the context of, say, for example, the question was before about the environment.
Well, you see, my argument, I'm not a nationalist, but I'd say work around institutions that have the best chance of doing the right thing. So I think that Scotland, as it has more power, has actually made some good choices. And if it was given more power, it probably would, all things considered. That's my criterion. So I'm not necessarily in favor of everybody's if we look at Spain, would I be interested in
Catalonia.
Catalonian independence? Well, probably not, because they tend to be quite conservative. they're privileged. It's a privileged part of the country, and they sort of like to maintain their privilege. So I don't have any parti pris for nationalist groups per se, but when they seem to have positive prospects, I don't have any parti pris for keeping the country together, keeping Great Britain together, keeping Canada together. I don't have that. Maybe I know in Ottawa a lot of people feel that way. I've always felt that somehow in Ottawa I couldn't relate to people very well, because there is this sense of Canadian identity that's quite strong.
Well, I'm Irish and I have a real strong Canadian identity. Actually.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I understand that, but I've never had it.
Okay,
So
thank you.
we have 5 minutes left, and a question that might be a good way of concluding the evening. This is from Joyce Wayne.
Oh, Joyce.
The question is, Henry, you are very definitive about the end of social democracy. Where do you see the future of progressive politics? Or do you see the future as a brutal battle between autocracy and democracy, as we're now watching in the Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I am fairly pessimistic, but I remember what I said, Joyce. Social democrats have to fight to keep the things that we want, and that's tough when you're facing the Trumps and the Putins and whatnot. So that's not it's not what we all dreamed of 50 years ago when we thought we could change the world for the better. This is a sort of conservative position, right? Holding on to what we have that was created to a large extent, directly or indirectly, by social democrats. So is that a pessimistic view? I think it probably is, because especially I'm, being 3/4 of a century old, it's not that pessimistic for me. But if I was a young progressive person who wants to make the world a better place, that would be pretty discouraging, I guess, right? Holding on to what we have should be our mission. So, but as an analyst of what's going on in the world, I wish I could do more. There's a guy named Robert Putnam, I'll end on this, who is in many ways the best analyst of American society. He wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone, which everybody read. And he had a really pessimistic idea of the US going down in terms of social capital, this idea of people working together and so on. And he's just written a new book called The Upswing. Very good historical analysis. He writes beautifully. And he's in his 80s. This is clearly his last book. How does he call it The Upswing? Because it's a very pessimistic book. I mean, it's all downhill from 1960, basically. Social capital was very strong, and people in these small communities worked together and so on. And that all fell apart. Why does he call it The Upswing? Well, most of it is about the upswing from 1895 to 1960. But he ends the last chapter saying, I see little signs of an upswing. See, these groups are getting together and so on. And on the internet, there are groups that are, and it's wishful thinking in some sense. I'm sympathetic to it because we need a sense of contributing towards something positively. And even Putnam, for all of his basic negative analysis that he's had all these years, even he's looking for something positive. So Joyce, if you can find something positive, because I know you look a lot at sort of grassroots stuff that's happening. If you can find examples of that we should talk about and get involved with, I wish you well, and I hope you're right, but I haven't yet really found that. So good luck. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Henry. Good evening. Thanks everyone for coming.